So welcome everyone to the Applied Algebraic Topology online seminar series. So the first speaker for the fall is Jānis Lazovskis, and the title of his talk is Moduli Spaces of Morse Functions for Persistence.
Thanks, Sarah. And thanks, Henry, Elhanan, and Sarah for having me on this platform. This is very cool. It's nice to still feel like part of a bigger group, even though traveling to the bigger group is kind of hard these days. So yeah, as Sarah mentioned, I'll be talking about moduli spaces of Morse functions for persistence. And this is the end result of about 2 years long collaboration with this group of people you see now. So Mike, Justin, Brittany, myself, Greg, Hans, Bei, and Matt, we all met at a conference at the Institute for Mathematics and Applications in Minneapolis in May 2018. I even forget what the topic of the conference was, but we had some very interesting discussions, and we decided to keep those going and chatted for a while, got some stuff on the go, and this summer published a paper as a result of that. And so I'll be taking a look back at what we talked about and about the results in the paper. I also feel like I could give another 40-minute talk about the group dynamics and how to do math in a group and the ethics and the do's and don'ts, well, at least from my perspective. But that's for a different time. So let me begin. So as I mentioned, this is based on our paper, Moduli Space of Morse Functions for Persistence, in the Journal of Applied and Computational Topology, published this summer. So the motivation that we started out with at the conference was we were wondering, what do functions that have the same barcode have in common? The idea being that the barcode is a fairly simple thing. It's very easy to use, but we wondered what's hiding behind it. Like what does it ignore? What doesn't it see? And we wanted to look at that from the context of Morse Smale functions, because they have a very nice decomposition and there's some cool combinatorics going on. So what I mean by that is this picture on the left here. So that's taken from Herzomerodion's 2001 paper, where they talk specifically about Morse functions, and they show that when you have a surface, so Morse function on a surface, then you can decompose this function into what they call quadrangles. Basically, faces with 4 edges where the faces follow a certain order, the vertices are maxima, minima, and saddle points, and everything is really nicely structured. So our take on it, which you can see on the right there, pretty much the same picture, just more colors and numbers, was, okay, so what happens when we, for instance, when we fix the number of maxima or minima? How many different pictures, how many different complexes can we get this way? And so the picture you see on the right here, I'll be using pictures like that quite a bit throughout this talk. And even though it's a disk, you should think of it, well, it is actually a function on a sphere. So you should think of the boundary of the disk as contracted to a single point. And this boundary will always be the global minimum. So in this case, it's when we have some other minima, some other maxima, which are red, and the saddle points, which are green. So the plan for today's talk is I'll first do a deep dive into invariance on the sphere, because we also restricted to Morse Smale functions on the sphere. I'll define what a Morse Smale function is in just a second. And I'll talk about some other invariants that are relevant, that have already been studied, and how we made some new invariants to take care of issues. Well, not take care of issues, but just to make them finer, just to refine the existing invariants. And then I'll talk about Morse Smale functions and how we can compare them by this quadrangle decomposition in the pictures you see right there. This was sort of a tangent to the original direction, but it got really interesting because we figured out a way how to relate Morse Smale functions just by looking at this combinatorial decomposition. And then I'll talk about comparing embeddings of the sphere in Euclidean space just by looking at the level sets. And this relates to invariance of Morse Smale functions on the sphere. Okay, so let's start with some background. So before we restrict to the sphere, if we just have a manifold with a Riemannian metric, nice in this case means whatever you want, smooth, compact, connected, and we have a function to the real line. then the function is a Morse function if all the critical points are non-degenerate. What that means is that the second derivative, so the Hessian is non-singular. For example, if you have a two-dimensional manifold, then you don't allow things like monkey saddle, where right, so monkey saddle is a saddle point with 3 downward directions and 3 upward directions. So that's not allowed because that's a degenerate critical point. But 2 downward directions are allowed. In the one-dimensional case, the function x cubed, that's not a Morse function because of what happens at 0. The second derivative is still 0 there. And all the functions that I'll talk about today are going to be excellent. That means that every critical value, in the preimage of every critical value, I have at most one critical, well, yeah, I have one critical point. Basically, 2 critical points don't map to the same critical value. And a Morse Smale function, a Morse function is Morse Smale if, when we look at the gradient of this function and we look at the stable and unstable manifolds of the critical points, they intersect transversally. And these intersections I'm going to call cells. So instead of getting into the nitty-gritty of this, I'm just going to show you some pictures to give you intuition of what I'm talking about. So if we start with a manifold, in this case, the sphere, right? So boundary contracted to a point. And then we have a function on this manifold. In this case, I've made 2 maxima, 1 saddle point in the middle, and then 1 minimum. Then from this, right, so this is a function, and we can take the gradient. And to each critical point, we can associate its stable and unstable manifold. So the stable manifold is the collection of points, well, defined as a set, but it's going to be a submanifold. The stable manifold is a collection of points that the gradient, so the gradient takes those points to that critical point as time goes to infinity. And the unstable manifold is all the points that get taken to that critical point as time goes to minus infinity. Here in this picture, I have 2 rows. So the top is going to be the stable manifold, and the bottom row is the unstable manifold. So we have 4 critical points, 2 maxima, a saddle, and a minimum. And for the maxima, the stable manifolds are just individual points, because of course, if we're just a bit away from that maximum, then everything will flow down as time goes to positive infinity. So that's down at the bottom there. I hope you can see the colors. Maybe there's not high enough contrast. And so when we intersect these, when we intersect any manifold from the top row with any manifold from the bottom row, we're going to get cells of the what's sometimes called the Morse Smale complex. But today I'm only going to be interested in the one skeleton of this Morse Smale complex, which can be considered as a graph, and I'm going to call that the Morse Smale graph. And you can think of this just as a graph with labeled vertices or with decorated vertices. And I allow multiple edges, as you can see in this case here. That's perfectly fine. So as I mentioned in the Herzomerodion's paper, they showed that when the manifold is 2-dimensional, then the faces of this graph always have 4 edges. And you can see that in the example on the right there. There's 2 faces, one on the inside of the circle, one on the outside. And even though it looks like there's only 3 edges on the inside, we count the edge from the saddle to the maximum twice, once from the top and then once coming from the bottom. So it still has 4 edges. And also they showed that the critical values around the faces will always follow a certain order. In this case, that order is going to be maximum saddle, minimum saddle. So these are some pretty restrictive, pretty strong conditions. And our thoughts were, okay, we get it. Let's play around with it. Let's see what happens. And so, as I mentioned initially, the question was, well, suppose we have 2 maxima or 3 maxima. What are all the possible Morse Smale graphs that we can get that conform to these conditions? So that was our initial approach, and we were thinking about Morse Smale graphs, Morse Smale functions on a sphere. So let me now talk about some equivalences of Morse and Morse Smale functions. If we just take 2 Morse functions with slicings f0 to fn and g0 to gm, where a slicing is those are collections of regular values for the functions, where in between fi and fi plus 1, we have exactly one critical value, and we capture all critical values that way. So if we have two slicings, then these two functions are going to be geometrically equivalent if we have orientation-preserving diffeomorphisms between the manifold and the real line, so that the obvious diagram commutes. Slightly coarser, so slightly weaker, we have topological equivalence, where we only ask for the sublevel sets to be diffeomorphic to each other. Right, so this is just, so this is strictly weaker than geometric equivalence. And then we can get even weaker, where instead of asking for diffeomorphism of the sublevel sets, we just ask that the ranks of the homology groups of the sublevel sets are the same. And that's homological equivalence. So these are some of the more common equivalences of Morse functions. And these were studied by Niculescu. He has several papers for functions on the sphere. And there's specifically one where he shows that the Rabe graph of a Morse function contains exactly the same information as geometric equivalence, basically saying two Morse functions on the sphere are geometrically equivalent if and only if they have the same Rabe graph, which is good to know. So we know that that's where the information is contained. And we showed that, well, the Rabe graph misses some stuff. So geometric equivalence misses some functions that are different. For instance, this example down at the bottom of your screen now. So these are two functions on the sphere, two Morse Smale functions. And you can tell just by the graph that they're not the same function, because the degrees of the vertices are different. And right, so I didn't define this explicitly, but two Morse Smale functions are graph equivalent if there is an isomorphism of labeled graphs between the two Morse Smale graphs. So these two functions are not graph equivalent, but they do have the same Rabe graph. They have the same merge tree, which is just like the Rabe graph, except instead of leveled sets, you take sublevel sets. And they have the same dimension 0 barcode. They have the same dimension 1 barcode. So in most common equivalence classes, these are considered to be the same functions, but we see they're not the same. So we can talk about graph equivalence and using the Morse Smale graph as an invariant for Morse Smale functions on the sphere.
Jānis, I wanted to ask a question, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
So I see why homologic equivalence is weaker than topological equivalence. I'm trying to see why topological equivalence is weaker than geometric equivalence. Would they be the same if in the definition of topological equivalence, I replaced the FIs and GIs for all I with all R's, like R is any real number, or sorry, R is a bad letter. Or
well,
how should I see the topological one's weaker than the geometrical one?
So maybe I should mention that these orientation preserving diffeomorphisms don't have to be the same for every I. So they can be different at each sublevel set.
Yep.
Maybe that's the key, because yeah, and also we don't have to have anything on the image, like the like the image can be different. It doesn't have to be. We don't have to have this diffeomorphism between the real line. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Totally. Using different diffeomorphisms at each level. Yeah, that definitely.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. So, right. So we have this graph equivalence, and a natural question to ask with all these equivalences is, all right, so we found something finer, but is this usable, right? I started by saying the barcode is super nice because it's simple, and here with this graph, it's fairly complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on. It's a lot to keep track of. Is this actually useful? So one direction to take would be to say, all right, let's try to strip away exactly what's different here than in the other ones, and try to make it simpler. And the other direction to take would be, let's see how far this rabbit hole goes, because there definitely does seem to be things, well, there are things that usual invariants miss. Maybe there's even more that this Morse Smale graph misses. And we decided to take this latter direction and try to still pry through and figure out exactly what's going on behind this Morse Smale graph, and perhaps see if there are other functions that are different that the Morse Smale graph misses. So let me talk about that for just a second for this next slide. One way to get through or to understand better this Morse Smale graph is to take a Morse Smale function from the sphere to the real line and factor it through a smooth embedding in R3. So in this case, here I have two embeddings of the sphere in R3, and they are so they are diffeomorphic to each other, right? We can take this this embedding on the left and sort of squish this shorter limb up and inside to get the embedding on the right. But if we say that that we want a factor, if we say that we want the Morse Smale function to factor as a smooth embedding and then as a projection to an axis, then these embeddings are different, but they do have the same Morse Smale graph, as you can see on the right. So the question is, how do we distinguish these? Because they heuristically seem like different embeddings, and I've kind of hinted at that with these level set circles that I've drawn here. So as you can see, at when the regular value is 1/2, or I guess 3/2, then the level sets are the same. They're still circles, and even at 2.5, right in the middle there, where the main difference is, we still have two circles, but for the image of iota1, it's the two circles are not nested, so they're not one inside the other. Whereas for iota2, they are nested, they are inside each other. So that gets to this main difference of these two embeddings. So as I mentioned, we factor this function in two different ways. Now, I'll do keep in mind that when we factor it in two different ways, it's still the same Morse Smale function, right? So the image on the real line is still going to be the same, but there's two different embeddings, two different factorizations of this function through R3. So then what I'm going to do a bit later is I'm going to consider the preimage of iota of f inverse of z as nested circles. And then we can talk about some equivalences in this context. So two compositions of the same Morse Smale function, factoring through R3 by a smooth embedding and then a projection onto the same axis. So they're going to be height equivalent if we can compare these two embeddings, iota1 and iota2, with a level set preserving homeomorphism, and the function that I described that simply pushes up this branch inside. That is level set preserving diffeomorphism, because we can still map sort of one circle to the other one. But these two functions are going to be poset equivalent if they are height equivalent, and this level set preserving map induces an isomorphism of nesting posets on all level sets. So I haven't defined nesting poset, and I'll define that in a couple of slides. But the idea is that this poset, this partial order, will describe how these circles are nested or are not nested. And I'll mention that these two pictures here, so these two embeddings, so this is sort of the main idea. This is why these are different. Justin likes to call these the worm and the shot glass. A less alcoholic terminology would be, I suppose, the non-nested and the nested embedding. Doesn't roll off the tongue quite as nicely. But yeah, so this is the main difference that we want to capture with another invariant. So before I get into the nesting poset, let me backtrack a bit and talk about this quadrangle decomposition of Aylesbury Herzomerodion and how we can use that to play around with to relate Morse Smale functions on the sphere. So Cerf in the 1970s showed that any two Morse functions on a nice manifold M, they're connected by a path in the space of all smooth functions in M. So that's a pretty wild statement, because if we consider the space of all smooth functions on M and we take any two Morse functions in that space, Cerf showed that we can find a path from one to the other where only at finitely many points this function is going to be non-Morse. And so our approach to this was, let's understand what happens at those finitely many non-Morse points. The way to think of it is maybe that the space of all smooth functions on M is stratified. So we have different strata where everything is Morse. And then the question is, what are these boundaries? How do we get from one stratum to another? And what we found out was that these boundaries are can be one of three things. When we restrict to the sphere, we showed that any such path in the space of smooth functions can be considered as a sequence of one of three types of local changes to this Morse Smale graph. So basically saying that these boundaries in the space of all smooth functions is, well, it's the boundaries are going to be fairly limited. So let me talk about what these boundaries are. And by boundary, I mean, well, so if we have one Morse function and another one, how do we get from it? Well, it's going to be some addition or removal of pairs of critical points. So the way to do that is either by what we call the face move, where a pair of critical points appears on the face of a Morse Smale graph. And the way to think of this is if you stretch a piece of fabric sort of diagonally, and then you poke your finger up from the bottom, you create another local min and sort of a saddle. And if you were to, I don't know, pour water or pour hot chocolate over this, then it would flow down from the maximum around this new local max and then down to the bottom. So that's what's going on there. And the face min move is the same, except you poke downwards instead of poking upwards. That's the face move. Then another move is an edge move, where instead of adding a pair of critical points on the face of a Morse Smale graph, you add it directly on an edge. So in this case, instead of having a piece of fabric like this at 2 points stretched, you stretch it at 3 points, one at the top and two at the bottom. And then you poke your finger up right in the middle. And now everything flows to two sides instead of around. It flows down two sides, and that's another way to change a Morse Smale function. And the non-Morse point is exactly at the point in time or point in this space of smooth functions where these two new critical points appear. And the final move is the most general. It's the vertex moves. So that's when one maximum or one minimum just splits into two. In fact, this vertex move is, yeah, as I said, it's the most general one, and the face and the edge moves are special cases of these. Because if for the vertex move you identify the top two saddle points, then you get the edge move. And if you identify the top two saddle points, the bottom two saddle points, and the two minima, and this picture that I have here, then you get the face move. So the general idea of what happens at a boundary is you choose a maximum or a minimum, and then you choose two faces that this maximum or minimum sits at. And if those two faces are next to each other, then you get the edge move. And if those faces are the same, then you get the face move. And if they're totally separate, then you get this vertex move. So a quick run through the proof. By an Euler characteristic argument, you can show that when you add or remove critical points, that must occur in pairs of adjacent indices, because the Euler characteristic of a surface can be given in, I think, as an alternating sum of the indices of its critical points, right? So in this case, you have -2, -1, and 0. And so you only can have adjacent indices changing. And then this, right, so we always need to have a saddle. And the saddle can appear in a face, on an edge, or at an existing vertex. That's simply by knowing that the surface decomposes as this quadrangle from Aylesbury and Herzomerodion's paper. And also from their paper, we know that saddles must have degree 4, and the faces always follow the same sequence of vertex types around them. So using all this information, we know that the connections of a new saddle will determine the type of move. That is, if we say have the face move and we introduce a saddle somewhere in the middle and a maximum somewhere in the middle, choosing where the saddle connects to, that will say, well, it has to be this way. There is no other choice. You must connect the edges this way. So that's a quick run through of the proof to showing that these are the only types of changes. Of course, you can have two of these changes happening at the same time, but these are the fundamental changes to Morse Smale functions, or to the Morse Smale graph of Morse Smale functions. And connecting this back to some of the invariants of the Rabe graph of F, these changes that I just talked about, the face, vertex, and edge moves, they add a branch to the Rabe graph of F. They add or remove a branch. And these specific changes to the Rabe graph were studied by DeFabio and Landi in 2016, and they called them elementary deformations. So these authors, they studied just the Rabe graph and changes to it, not really looking at the functions where they come from, but it's nice to know that these changes that they consider elementary, those are the ones that we also found to be elementary. And since this is such a nice combinatorial setup, one of our co-author students, Bei student Yuja, she made this really cool interactive playground online that lets you create your own Morse Smale function, change it, and do these exact moves that I just talked about, and go back and forth, and just see what happens. Which again goes back to the very beginning, that our goal was to play around with the combinatorics. So yeah, okay, I think I have a bit of time. I want to show you how this works because it's very cool. There we go. Okay, so this is Yuja's GitHub. The interactive is called MVF Designer. I suggest you check it out, and I have a version running on my screen. Do you see this? Do you see this screen here? Okay, so
We do.
Great. So the setup is the same as I just had in the slides, but instead of a circle, you have a square. And the nice thing here, though, is that instead of trying to visually think of, well, okay, I have, a piece of fabric and some critical points and maximum minima, you can turn on the visualization and see exactly where these points are going to flow. And you can also move things around, and the flow will adjust. So this is a really neat tool to look at the space of all Morse functions. And you can do these moves. Say we do a edge move right here, it automatically sets it up, and we can still move things around. Oh, and so here it also shows, well, it's kind of hard to see, maybe I'll make it better. So if something is incorrect mathematically, it will highlight it in red and it will tell you you need to rearrange these edges. And then once you do, so that everything follows the correct mathematical setup, it will go back, and you can keep doing this, maybe add another one here. Oh, so now we got to fix this. And it's really nice because it tells you what went wrong. And if you really want, you can undo your previous moves and redo things. So yeah, so this is a really neat tool. I think I've got, and you can also import configurations. I've got this complicated configuration here. This is just some Morse Smale function that I made. It's Morse Smale graph. And even more, if I could get it working, I don't really have it working right now, but this connects with Vidit Nanda's program Perseus, and it computes the homology, and it even shows which bar corresponds to which max saddle or min saddle connection, if such a bar that corresponds to a connection exists. So yeah, so I suggest you check it out. This is a really neat tool. You just spent quite a lot of time with this, and yeah, it's really fun to play around with, because this is what we wanted to get at, to play around with the space of all Morse Smale functions. Okay, let me get back to my slides. All right. So one thing I mentioned briefly, but I didn't talk about in detail, was the nesting poset. So we had, right, so the setup was a function a Morse Smale function from S2 to R that factors through a smooth embedding iota into R3, and then through a projection onto an axis pi. So so these circles are going to be iota of F inverse of Z. And whenever Z is a regular value, these circles are going to be either separate or nested. And I've drawn this nesting poset. I haven't defined it yet. I'll define it at the bottom of this slide. And this just shows that, what does this show? These are just the two things that we can have. Of course, we can have a lot of circles, but this is the basic situation when we have a regular value. When we have a critical value, then we have circles, but we also can have a wedge of two circles, or we can have a single isolated point, for instance, when we're at a maximum or at a minimum. And the wedges and the wedge of two circles can also be nested as on the right, or it can be next to each other as in the middle. So although it would be nice to put an order on the circles, because I've been talking about these circles in iota of f inverse of z, it turns out it's a bit easier in terms of actually going through all the definitions. It's easier to define an order on the complement of the circles. So basically on this plane minus the circles, which is just the connected components of the space. And since it's since pi inverse of z minus iota of f inverse of z is a mouthful, I'm just going to call this space x sub z. So I'm going to define a partial order on pi naught of x sub z on the connected components here. And the steps to define this partial order are first going to be when we choose a value, either regular or critical, we're going to label these circles, these Jordan curves, as they actually are, from gamma 1 to gamma n. And we can do that for regular values. It's pretty clear that we can always define them in a coherent way. When we have a wedge of two circles, up to choosing which one is on the left and which one is on the right, we can still do that by saying, so two Jordan curves are going to be semi-disjoint if they share a single point. And that's exactly what happens when we have the wedge, or when one is on the inside and one is on the outside. Again, due to the fact that the Jordan curves, we can say something is the interior and something is the exterior, because the Jordan curve splits the plane up into two pieces. So we label all these Jordan curves, and then we call the unbounded component, the largest component, we call that P naught in the set of all connected components. And then for all the other elements in this set, Pi is going to be the component whose exterior boundary is gamma I. So I put that in quotations because it's actually, we have to think of the closure of these components and then take the boundary there, right? So for each connected component in this complement, we always, well, the boundary of the closure is going to be some collection of these circles, of these Jordan curves. But one is distinguished, and that's the one where, and that's gamma I, because we know that in the interior of gamma I, that will contain all the other circles in this boundary, and that's only true for one of them. For the ones in the for the ones that aren't the exterior, they won't contain all the other circles in their interior. So that's how we define these PIs, these other elements of the set of connected components. And we're going to say that Pi is less than or equal to Pj whenever the interior of gamma I, so the associated Jordan curve, sits inside the interior of gamma j, or when R2 minus the interior of gamma j is unbounded. And the second point basically says that this nesting poset always has a largest element, and that's going to be the unbounded component here. And this turns out to be a partial order, mainly coming from the fact that set containment, or set containment is a partial order. And so we call this set with this partial order the nesting poset. So a natural question to ask when some new object is defined is, all right, well, what are functions of this object? So what are maps between different nesting posets? And we're going to use topology to motivate maps between posets. Of course, in some cases, when we have two regular values with no critical values in between them, it's pretty obvious. They're just isomorphisms. But when we have critical values, it's not so clear. Well, here I'm saying it is clear for regular values and the maximin, and it's pretty straightforward for the maximin. So here I have a picture of this is going to be a local minimum with some level sets around it, and at xz and at the two level sets below it, the nesting poset is just a single element. And of course, this is just a local picture, but I'm just going to assume that this is all we have going on. So at the three bottom levels, we just have a single element for the poset, and then at the two levels up above it, we have a two-element poset. One element in the poset for the disk inside, and then one for the unbounded element. And as I said, if we want topology to motivate maps between these posets, well, we definitely have isomorphisms down below, but between xz and xz plus epsilon, we can we can include, or we have an injection from the punctured plane to a plane with a disk taken out of it. So the poset map is going to go from xz up to xz plus epsilon, where we include this single poset element that represents the unbounded component into the poset element that still represents the unbounded component, just at a higher level. So pretty straightforward there. However, for saddle points, it's not that clear. This is the local picture at a saddle point, and at the saddle we have 4 pieces. Let's make it a bit simpler. Let's go down just below the saddle point, where we have what looks like 3 pieces. So the question is, what does the nesting poset look like just below a saddle point? Well, I have these two white curves drawn here, but it's unclear how they connect. For instance, they could be just circles, one on the left, one on the right, in which case I would have a 3-element poset where 2 of the bottom elements can't be compared. Or I could have a circle on the left, but maybe this white line on the right loops around back and contains that one, in which case I would have a linear poset where we can compare all the elements. So yeah, so those are the situations that can happen, and that of course impacts what these poset maps are going to be. And the resolution to fix this, as I just said, is just to consider the larger picture at saddles. So we showed that depending on the type of saddle that we have, we can always make canonical choices for the maps between the posets. And the types of saddles that we have are the non-nesting saddle, also known as the pair of pants, and the nesting saddle, also known as the pair of pants with a leg tucked inside the other leg of pants. They are, as you can see on the left here, they have the same barcode. So the barcode does not distinguish between a nesting saddle and a non-nesting saddle, but we do want to distinguish between them. And the way we do that is we have the same picture as in the previous slide, but at a slightly larger perspective. So if we have these 2 circles, as I said, it's a 3-element poset where the bottom 2 elements can't be compared. And we have an isomorphism between that poset and between the nesting poset at the critical point. And that kind of makes sense because we can, I've drawn the arrow from the critical point down to the bottom because it makes more sense topologically to include, here I have B prime into B and C prime into C, and then A prime into A. It's kind of harder. Well, it's not canonical how to split up this larger A unbounded component to get it to A prime, but the posets are still isomorphic. Now, just above, if we look at the nesting saddle picture, what's happening is these 2 legs of these pants are actually merging. So it would be natural to say, well, the 2 poset elements that represented these 2 legs of pants, they should merge to the same poset element. So that's exactly what we do. And so we have a surjection to the poset just above this saddle point. We have a 2-element poset where the poset elements representing B prime and C prime both map to the poset element representing B double prime. For the nesting saddle, it's pretty similar. Again, down below, we have an isomorphism induced by topological inclusion going that way. But now instead of a surjection up to just above the critical point, we have an inclusion going down. The reason is that while it still would be natural to say, well, the inside of the pant leg and the outside merge together, and so topologically they present just a point the same piece. The problem is that this B prime, this inside of the pants, is right in the middle between those 2. And if we map, I guess in this case it's A prime and C prime, both to the unbounded component, then we have to map B prime as well to the unbounded component. And that really destroys this thing that we want to keep a track of. So what we're going to do is we're instead going to consider the inclusion going from just above the critical point to the critical point. And so that gives us an inclusion of posets as well. It's still natural. We definitely can include B double prime into B prime, and that gives us another map of posets. So what what this shows is that we always have a zigzag of postsets given a Morse Smale function on the sphere. So now I want to end off with some extensions. Right, so as I just said, this barcode can be considered as a zigzag of postsets. But we can take this even further, and so Hans, also co-author, he talked about taking this to a zigzag of algebras, where the algebra is the algebra of intervals of a postset. So we can add some more structure to this barcode. And that seems like a pretty reasonable thing to do, because again, the barcode is pretty simple, everyone understands it, and if we just put some more structure on it, that is potentially very useful. Another direction to take this in, which is what Justin and some of his students have done, is to count the preimages of a barcode, because every open-ended barcode or a fork in a rave graph is going to be a choice of a nesting or a non-nesting saddle. So what I mean is, if for instance we have a barcode with 3 nested bars, you can see on the right there, then if we add first the largest bar, then the next one, adding each new bar gives 2 choices, or so 2 choices for every existing branch of this embedding that we have. And so it seems like these choices are going to grow exponentially the more bars we add. But of course, that's the naive approach, and that doesn't always work. So some natural questions to ask here are, well, do we have some choices forced, or do we double count when we have non-nested pairs of bars, or what if we have more than one maximum? So this is a direction that our current work has been taken in, and that's given some pretty interesting results. And the final direction to think about is, well, what if we didn't use the sphere? Because we definitely used some nice properties of the sphere, the Euler characteristic, existing results. But what if it wasn't the sphere? What if it was a different surface? So staying in 2 dimensions, but we changed the Euler characteristic. Or what if it wasn't even orientable, some n-dimensional manifold? For instance, we can think of 3-dimensional manifolds. If we had a function from S3 to R, then the preimage, instead of having to be a 1-dimensional manifold, which we know it's either going to be the circle or the line, it's going to be some 2-dimensional manifold in this case. So now you can think of, well, maybe I have a 5-hole torus and I have a single-hole torus sitting inside it. So there's also some very cool combinatorics going on there, because you can choose which hole it sits around. And I think that's where I'll stop. So thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you. So before we get to questions, I would ask everyone to unmute themselves so that we can thank Jānis properly.
Thank you.
Okay, so now go ahead and ask as many questions as you wish. Yeah, so you have to unmute yourself to ask questions. Again, if you muted yourself again.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, so this is kind of a meta question. Do you think there's a good reason why this extra information is coming in the form of a poset? It's not necessarily an algebraic invariant. Why do you think to capture what you want to capture, you have to look at this nesting structure? I don't know if you can give some more insight into that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Why a poset structure? I think that was because when we looked at the different embeddings, that seemed to be the best way to capture the difference, right? Because if we just say there exists some sort of a map or some other sort of a map, it's a really simple map to go from one to the other. And we realized, well, we definitely have to restrict to level sets. We have to keep the level set in mind. And the level set is super simple. It's just a collection of curves. And so how do you relate these curves? And perhaps because some of us were working with posets, I definitely was at that time. I was thinking a lot about posets, a lot about orders. I'm certain some of the other people in our group were as well. That seemed like the most natural thing to say. Well, the way to distinguish this is to say this circle is related to this circle in that way, but this one is related in a different way. And how best to do that with a poset? Yeah.
And you said that this equivalence is not everything. So there's more structure that isn't captured.
Well, there's more structure. So the Morse Smale graph doesn't capture everything. I think in one of the slides where I talked about, yeah, right. So here, these two embeddings, right? So it's the same Morse Smale function. So it has one Morse Smale graph. And so in this case, it's more about equivalences of embeddings and projections rather than equivalences of Morse functions. Which
I see.
Yeah. So it's definitely kind of sidestepping the problem, not saying we have two different Morse functions. I mean, right? They're not too different. They are the same Morse function, but they factor differently through the space. Perhaps there's even more that's missing if we, I suppose, have some even stricter conditions. I suppose factor through another space or project in a different way, factor twice. Yeah, there could be other things that are missing, but this was like the next step to say, all right, what's going on under the hood for this Morse Smale graph. And a lot of this stuff came from, yeah. And while I'm on this train of thought, we often thought of this as like, okay, so we have an embedded sphere. What happens? Well, so at first it just seemed like you get the Morse Smale graph by puncturing, say in these pictures, by puncturing the bottom of the sphere and then like stretching this hole out, and then you get one of these pictures. And that works, I guess, for iota 2 in this picture. Right, that kind of makes sense. You poke a hole in the bottom, you stretch it out, and then you get exactly what you have on the right. But for iota 1, if you poke a hole in the bottom, you still have this sort of overhang, which is hard to draw as a two-dimensional graph or as a two-dimensional complex. So yeah, so we realized that's not the right way of doing it, and so we just talked about embeddings.
Thank you.
Okay, more questions.
I wanted to ask a question with sort of a strange one, but when you were showing Yujia's very nice demo, Jānis, it reminded me of these demos where you they sort of throw a graph in the plane, and then all the edges are straight, and your task is to move the vertices to make the graph planar. So they give you a planar graph, it's embedded in a non-planar way, and then the game is to, and so the question is, what game can you build here? So like, maybe you have like an epsilon where you're allowed to do simplifications with an epsilon, and you need to like find the simplest, like simplification with the fewest critical points, or it sounded like you had a game in mind.
Well, so the game that I usually play with this is you can move these connections. So for instance, here, now I'm moving the connection, this settlement connection. Oh no, I've kind of broken it. Let me move it back. So now I'm moving this this settlement connection from this minimum to this minimum. And so now the game would be, well, how do I fix this, right? Because I have a saddle max and a saddle min crossing. So perhaps the solution would be to move this over here. So now we still have another problem, and perhaps we need to move this back here. But then we still have another problem because this is a face with only 2 edges, and it has to have 4 edges by Herzomerodion. So then I don't know, maybe move it down here, but still have some problems.
So like find the fewest number of moves to fix it, or you could even like assign a price to each move, and then
Yeah.
All right.
And in fact, what I didn't mention is that there's you can change the function values, the heights of these maxima, and that will impact the barcode computation. So that's another way of doing it. Maybe if you want to, play around with that. But there's definitely a ton of things to do here.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay, more questions for Jānis.
I guess I'll ask one more question if it's okay. So suppose you jump to 3 manifolds. What do you think will replace? What do you think will happen with nesting? What is the appropriate concept?
Well, right. So for regular values, I think there still is some interesting combinatories going on there, right? Say in the simplest case, you have just a well, that's not even the simplest case, but the simplest interesting case where you have so instead of 2 circles that are nested, 2 one-dimensional manifolds, you have 2 two-dimensional manifolds. Say a 2 torus and a 1 torus, right? So the 1 torus you can wrap around one of the holes, the other holes, or both the holes. So there's 3 different ways to do it. Of course, if you increase them, increase the number of holes in this torus, there's more ways of doing it. Yeah, and though I'm not sure what would happen if at a critical value, because then these 2 tori somehow need to intersect, and I think they would probably intersect in a 1 manifold. So then the question would be which fundamental class do you choose for both of these manifolds of dimension 2? Of course, yeah, I suppose it could be a sphere, make it a much simpler. But say you have a 1-hole torus and a 2-hole torus where they intersect, and so there's definitely combinatorics there, because there's a finite number of these fundamental classes, and then depending on which one you choose, you get some sort of a weird nested pre-image. And I'm not sure if, well, it still seems like a poset could work there, right? Because there still is some nesting, so there still is some order. Yeah.
This is maybe a completely off the base question, but you think there could be any complications about how actually the I don't know. I mean, so sometimes in geometric topology, you worry when you glue something in, there could be a complicated twist happening.
Right.
Does that seem plausible, or is that it's not applicable in this setting, do you think?
Well, yeah, I don't think it would be applicable, right? Because even here, when I talked about pre-images, right, we could have a circle wrapping around twice, and that doesn't really make a difference, because we actually cared about the complement of these circles rather than the images themselves. So if the same approach were to be extended, I don't think that the twisting would make a big difference. Although, yeah, this is me just thinking about this now for half a minute. But this was definitely one of the directions that we talked about near the end, and we somehow decided. Well, we decided that it was pretty complicated, and it would and it would take another big push to get it to that point. And so we just were like, this is pretty good what we got.
Fair enough, because the only thing that this vaguely reminds me of, and I know it's quite far away, is that in geometric topology and the study of surfaces and also 3 manifolds, there's the combinatorics of the intersections of curves, this curve complex. And it's also a similar like combinatorial invariant that you use to keep track of and study surfaces and sometimes 3 manifolds. It doesn't really quite capture nesting, but it reminds me of, I don't know if there are any similar parallels there. Anyhow, very interesting.
Yeah, definitely could be beyond my expertise, but yeah, perhaps all the stuff I've just talked about is complete nonsense, and this is where the interesting stuff lies. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Jānis, so much. So I will stop the recording now and leave a couple of minutes for questions offline.